Last week, President Trump gave a speech in Poland that was then panned at the Atlantic in James Fallow's article, How American Presidents Used to Speak Overseas. Peter Beinart's piece, The Racial and Religious Paranoia of Trump's Warsaw Speech, and in a very different vein, in David Frum's The Falsehood at the Core of Trump's Warsaw Speech. The main source of offense for Fallows and Beinart is Trump's civilizational thinking as expressed in passages like these, from Trump's speech, of course. The Polish experience reminds us the defense of the West ultimately rests not only on means, but also on the will of its people to prevail and be successful and get what you have to have. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? And our fight for the West does not begin on the battlefield. It begins with our minds, our wills, and our souls. Today, the ties that unite our civilization are no less vital and demand no less defense than that bare shred of land on which the hope of Poland once totally rested. Our freedom, our civilization, and our survival depend on these bonds of history, culture, and memory. President Trump played heavily on the Polish struggle with the Nazis and the chant of "We want God" during the Mass with Pope John Paul II at Victory Square in 1979, after decades of communist oppression. The Polish, Trump said, are a people who, for centuries, have summoned the courage and the will to defend our civilization. They are a people who have never ever forgotten who they are. Yet, at the end of it all, Poland faces a resurgent Russia, who the president enjoined to align with Eastern Europe and America against a civilizational opponent, Islam, or specifically radical Islam. Poland also faces bullying from the EU, mainly from Germany, for departing from the EU mainstream. Trump's warm words for Poland not only affirmed the struggle of the Polish people, but addressed their security concerns while sticking a thumb in Angela Merkel's eye. Thus the speech was delivered amidst applause and cheers. Enter Monsieurs Fallows and Beinart. Fallows asks whether America is an idea or ethnic group, and casts aspersions on connecting civilization to blood ties. By drawing this connection, Fallows contends that Trump has embarked on an unprecedented departure from presidential rhetoric following World War II. Beinart argues that the West is a racial and religious term, with no legitimate place in presidential discourse. These criticisms raise some important questions, like in what way is President Trump's rhetoric different from past presidents? What is a civilization? What is the West? Frum, however, complains that the falsehood at the core of this speech has not so much to do with the speech itself as it does with the speaker. This raises a further question. Who has the authority to speak for, let alone raise, the West? Here, I draw out the assumptions underlying Fallows and Beinart's piece, and will argue that their criticisms rest on an arid notion of civilization that is atomizing and alienating. Human beings need something more than universal liberal values, and this something more represents a common property with a place in our politics. The thought that this something more is the special province of xenophobes, racists, and right-wing nuts is deeply misguided and reveals a sickness at the heart of our modern West. It's correct that President Trump's rhetoric departs from other presidents since World War II. Consider Fallow's example of Jimmy Carter and Beinart's example of George W. Bush. In his first year as president, President Carter himself spoke in Poland. Though he touched on ties of history and blood, the tenor of President Carter's message plays heavily on the notes of freedom and justice. Fallows notes that such talk points to universal values and hopes, lamenting that a president's role when traveling has, until now, been to speak for the American idea. America, the idea, then, is a collection of universal values and hopes, independent of those very particular ties of history, shared experience, and blood. Beinart, however, examines President Bush's rhetoric through the early 2000s, noting that to notice how different that rhetoric was from Trump's, look at how the last Republican president, George W. Bush, spoke when he visited Poland in his first presidential visit in 2001. Bush never referred to the West. He did tell Poles that we share a civilization. But in the next sentence, he insisted that its values are universal. Because they are, he declared, our transatlantic community must have priorities beyond the consolidation of European peace. Beinart goes on to celebrate Bush for not bringing up civilization at all by 2003. There is a whiff here of the lefty tactic of bemoaning the loss of the good old days of decent Republicans, hatred of whom is conveniently forgotten in comparison to the current rabble. But I'll leave that aside. Much more important is Beinart's distaste for civilizational thinking when speaking of the will of the West to survive, which is linked to the rhetoric of Mussolini, Hitler, and the Empire of Japan. In the movie Independence Day, an imaginary president invokes humanity's will to survive against imaginary aliens. Does that mean that being stirred by that speech reveals interplanetary crypto-fascism? I'll give you a hint, it doesn't. I take it that Beinart's real point is to decry us versus them thinking. After all, Beinart points out that you can really only see Islam or radical Islam as a threat to the West if you see Muslim migrants to Europe as invaders. But this just is the way the people of Eastern Europe, and increasingly the people of Western Europe, conceive of their experience with Islam of late. There is historical precedent for this attitude. It is easy to forget that the Crusades came after centuries of invasion that had destroyed Christian North Africa, consumed Visigothic Spain, conquered Sicily, and pummeled Byzantium. The Ottoman incursions commenced for centuries after the final collapse of Outremer in the 13th century, not to mention the Barbary slave trade. However we understand the current migrant crisis in Europe, there are important features of Fallows and Beinart's analysis that are worth pointing out. When Fallows asks whether America is an idea or an ethnic group, we might as easily ask whether the West is an idea or an ethnic group. Both Fallows and Beinart point to ideas. These ideas are universal and independent of any particular historical embodiment in a culture or tradition. Here there is distaste for playing to a common bond deeper than allegedly universal values. For this reason, playing to America or Western civilization as an idea is conceived as the proper province of the president, our common property. By departing from speaking of America or Western civilization as an idea, President Trump does represent a shift away from previous post-World War II presidents because, as a friend of mine put it in discussion, he fundamentally does not get what used to be the common property between the two parties. That common property just is, say, America as an idea. The reason is that understanding America or the West as something involving a common culture, shared experience, or religion is exclusionary in a way that a common stock of dehistoricized ideals is not. Playing to the particularity of the West throws into question the universal globalist society of Western liberal democracy imagined by thinkers like Francis Fukuyama. Central to this idea is that the end of the Cold War represents the inevitable and final dominion of secular liberal democratic globalism, the end of history. This view is shared, in one way or another, by many Democrats and Republicans, as evidenced by each party's interventionist foreign policy over the last several decades. The complaint about shifting from universal values to the historically and culturally rooted and Christian, then, is not a partisan one. Now, there is a tension between the idea that secular liberal democratic and globalist values are objective, universal values to which we are all universally beholden, and the idea that they are not, that is, that there are different justices for different peoples. From a human rights-centered or otherwise Kantian view of morality, different justices for different peoples is bound to look dangerously relativistic or postmodern, as fascism actually was. On the liberal view, we are faced with choosing between universal liberal values and racist ethno-states. This is what Fallows and Beinart are worried about. We must ask whether the choice is really this stark, however, and we must ask what it means to be a people. Among the most important philosophical thinkers of the last 2,000 years is St. Augustine of Hippo, who described a people as human beings united under one law, a temporal law. Temporal law is a law that can be changed over the course of time, but that always gains its legitimacy from an unchanging and eternal moral law. This distinction is what makes possible Augustine's famous remark that an unjust law is no law at all. If there were no eternal law, there could be no way to assess the justice of those laws and traditions by which a particular people group is bound. Augustine makes the further point that the justice of a people's political constitution is relative to the character of that people. Thus, a well-ordered people who care about the public interest ought to govern themselves. A corrupt people, in which votes are bought and sold and in which honors are coveted, ought to be governed by a powerful and good ruler. By reference to temporal law, these two constitutions are at odds. By reference to the eternal law, they are not. The point so far establishes different temporal laws and so different peoples on a hierarchy of virtue. Such an ordering is sometimes appropriate. However, there could be non-hierarchical differences, that is, differences that really are equally just. Augustine himself quotes the prophet Isaiah's remark that unless you believe, you will not understand. To modern ears, this sounds hideously circular. However, Augustine is making an important epistemological point. There are truths that cannot be grasped by taking a neutral and external view from nowhere, which is just what universal liberal values claim to be, a view from nowhere. Thus, the collective wisdom of a people is transmitted through a tradition that, once it has taken root, can then be understood and developed. It is natural to expand the point. Particular people's circumstances have produced a variety of mythologies, legends, music, and other cultural forms and achievements that give different peoples their different characters, their different ways of being in the world, and that establish particular obligations among their members that differ from the obligations shared between the members of other people groups. These cultural patterns are just and good insofar as they direct people toward eternal and universal goods, and are unjust insofar as they don't. Because they are embodied, tied to particular stories, traditions, and languages, these differences resist reduction to a set of abstract universal values. In fact, trying to understand the justice of a culture just in terms of abstract universal principles winds up trivializing the actual diversity one encounters. This trivialization of difference, wherein it is collapsed into items on a menu, is among the most insidious effects of liberal globalism and exposes the crassness of the social justice and globalist left's diversity sermonizing. These differences, because they touch character, mythology, and the transcendent, have a spiritual dimension. What C.S. Lewis had his characters refer to as the haunting of each people in his fantastical science fiction story, That Hideous Strength. This haunting is alive in every people and different in each. Referring to the differences in our mythic pasts, he has one of his characters say, "When Logres really dominates Britain, when the goddess Reason, the divine clearness, is really enthroned in France, when the order of heaven is really followed in China, why then it will be spring." Logres, of course, refers to the unique rootedness of England in the Arthurian legend. The goddess Reason refers to in a very complex way to France's experience of the Revolution. And the order of heaven refers to China's unique understanding of that idea, achieved through its Taoist and Confucian past. These particularities, as the story has it, produce in each people a distinctive character and way of living out the good. This is an interesting idea, and is preceded by an important insight. He who thinks of goodness in the abstract soon reaches the fatal idea of something standardized, some common kind of life to which all nations ought to progress. Of course, there are universal rules to which all goodness must conform, but that's only the grammar of virtue. It's not where the sap is. The advantage of what I'll call the Augustine-Lewis view is that it gets the order of goods right, and so respects the actual diversity of human cultures. This order begins with God, and what goodness means for human beings in general. Culture is how these goods are achieved through particular customs. Politics is thus the tool we use to direct a culture through a particular phase of its history. Politics is subordinated to culture, and culture is subordinated to God. In this is tremendous room for variety, even across something like Christendom with its creeds. Indeed, it was within a broader Christendom that Lewis imagined the spring of heightened variety between and unity among the peoples of this earth. The problem with Fallows and Beinhardt is that they raise the contingencies of a particular form of politics that arose in a particular place, the American colonies, for particular reasons to the status of an eternal good. In this light, genuine differences between peoples and whole civilizations must be washed away so that all may be blended into a one politics to rule them all, secular, liberal, democratic model, complete with a globalist trade scheme and an ever-expansive and so increasingly useless idea of human rights. Unrooted, rights talk represents a growing tendency to trade transcendence for the cult of unrestricted choice, and liberalism, a continued reduction of social relations to the stuff of contracts. This unrootedness contributes to alienation, atomization, and decay. Therefore, contrary to Fallows and Beinhardt, no healthy politics can be restricted to universal liberal values abstracted from the traditions and institutions of a particular people. Healthy political discourse must make use of thicker bonds. Edmund Burke illustrated this idea by contrasting the American and French revolutions. The governing institutions of the American colonies represented a development of a parliamentary trend that had been growing in English culture over centuries, and these institutions had achieved maturity and autonomy in America by 1776. Not only did the colonists demand only what other English citizens already possessed, but no such development had occurred in France, whose revolution represented a radical break from tradition. We know the consequence, the Reign of Terror. There is a lesson here for the interventionists and nation builders with their cookie-cutter liberalism. So far, I've said a lot about being a people and very little about civilization. As Samuel Huntington points out in Clash of Civilizations, a civilization is a cultural entity, and both civilization and culture refer to the overall way of life of a people. It is therefore easy to use terms like civilization and people interchangeably. This is not the right way to expand the Augustine Lewis view to establish the value of talking about civilization. A civilization is not necessarily a single people. English, French, Spanish, and German culture grew together from a common experience with tribal Celtic and Germanic paganism, Rome and its fall, feudalism, the three-crop rotation, the medieval concept of kingship, the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately of Christianity. Though things like English, French, Spanish, and German feudalism differed in important details, England had the Magna Carta, Spain the Reconquista, and so on, the similarities are hard to ignore and produce an overall identification with a cultural unit of historically related values, institutions, practices, and ways of thinking, and religion bigger than the culture of each people. As cousins, you might think of as identifying with a larger family. They identify with each other. Yet defining the West is complex. The corner cases can help us explain historical, political, and religious factors constituting full membership. It is impossible to speak of the West apart from Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and the churches of the Reformation, to be specific. However, the most Catholic nation on the planet is the Philippines. Yet France, when it was still Catholic, had more in common culturally with England, with whom its history had been bound for centuries, than with the Philippines. Additionally, Latin America is partially Western in that it is composed of former territories of Spain, with the Christian and European heritage that goes with that. On the other hand, it has stood outside the Anglo-American political order that is the modern basis of the West's political unity. This is perhaps why Fallows and Beinhardt slide between speaking of the West and speaking of America in their discussions. Still, Latin America and the Philippines share something very deep with the West, and do not stand entirely apart from it. Thus, we can speak of the West as European or as aligned with the Anglosphere on the one hand, but the Western expression of an expansive Christendom whose mythos and liturgy bind whole peoples of quite different cultural traditions together in a single ecclesia, cannot be overemphasized. It is on this point that Beinhardt is frustrating for getting things almost right. He bemoans the term Western as a religious term, and a religious term it is. Religion does set up a border, and so is exclusive. But it should be clear by now that such borders are important to human community and flourishing. Indeed, the West as a religious term can help us avoid establishing the vapid and leveling standardization of one-size-fits-all secular liberal democratic globalism. Difficulties aside, the West is constituted by points of identification that are neither stupidly essentialist nor racist. Surely, Augustine, whose father was ethnically Latin and whose mother was ethnically Berber, would understand that very broad forms of identification, like his own African, Roman, and Christian, can go beyond ethnicity and race. This is especially notable for the fact that Augustine is the key touchpoint for Western theology and of much Western philosophy, giving clear expression to that broadest level of identification, establishing a concrete bond between the West and the rest of Christendom. In this way, Western civilization is, in fact, part of the common property of Poland and America, and even of Democrats and Republicans. Healthy politics in the West, and in relation to the rest of Christendom and to the world, is impossible without acknowledging this fact. Fallows and Beinhardt worry that casting Islam as the great antagonist of this age is misguided. This is not entirely wrong, but not for the reasons Fallows and Beinhardt would suppose. Though the invasions of the caliphates into Europe arguably contributed to the West's self-consciousness as a distinct part of Christendom, it is valuable to reflect on the antagonist in that hideous strength, that is, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, the NICE. NICE is an aggressively secular scientific research organization cut free from any real sense of transcendent purpose or moral restraint. It represents a perversion of the injunction to subdue nature, where subdue is understood as sheer despotic dominance instead of loving authority. What President Trump has missed from the inception of his campaign is that the West is infected throughout by aggressive secularism, by the NICE. The Warsaw speech is right, however, that the battle for the West begins in the soul. Insofar as we demand Muslim migrants to conform to a West understood in utterly secular terms, we demand that they conform to something to which no one ought to conform. Though it is right at this time for Europe to curb the flood of migrants as soon as it can, the European peoples and America as well must also confront this internal moral and spiritual problem, so that those coming here from other civilizations have something robust and meaningful to assimilate too. The idea of spiritual rot and diminishment brings us to Fromm's point about the falsehood at the heart of President Trump's speech. When I first heard the speech, I immediately thought of Aragorn's speech to the remnant of the armies of Gondor and Rohan before the gates of Mordor in Peter Jackson's rendition of Return of the King, which went like this: I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day, an hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down, but it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West. But President Trump's speech is not like Aragorn's in this important respect. It is hard to imagine Gandalf cheering Aragorn's speech coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. Aragorn's speech is true in the sense of rightly commanding both obedience and inspiration because of who Aragorn is. He embodies in his own person that very thing for which he calls men to wager their lives. Because of this, Aragorn's words are not just true, but trustworthy. In a way, President Trump was defeated long ago by the sexual revolution and fell under its power. Through his entertainment properties, he has done a great deal to promote the sexualization and graspiness undermining Western civilization and sapping its vital energy. Therefore, President Trump is implicated in our destruction more than any merely rhetorical defense can counteract, however true that rhetoric is. This is the essence of the lie Frum is pointing to. But Boromir, a villain who fell under the power of the ring, tried to seize it for his own, and so drove Frodo from the Fellowship, shows us that even a flawed and corrupted man can see the value of what he has threatened and defend it, and I think this is worth thinking about in this context. Whether President Trump has it within himself to play Boromir is a serious question. At any rate, the left is wrong to simply dismiss the Warsaw speech as ethno-nationalist dog whistling, or to strike it because it was a corrupted man who delivered it. In conclusion, President Trump hit on something in his Warsaw speech that is worth hearing. The borders of the European West are beset. These borders include, most importantly, the borders of the heart, in addition to the physical boundaries protecting the unique character of its peoples, a uniqueness that is sapped and flattened by liberal globalism. How else, for example, can Swedes tolerate the message that they have no native culture as they did in 2015? Certainly, European leaders have a duty to protect their individual peoples for their own preservation, and for the preservation of a broader West tied by important cultural experiences. However, the West is also the Christian West, and so part of Christendom at large. It is in reference to that the West must understand its value and unique character, and it is in reference to that the worst fears of Fallows and Beinhart are dissolved. Moreover, it is the dimming light of what is increasingly the memory of Christianity that Westerners can see, or in which Westerners can see the awful destructive power of aggressive secularism and a liberalism elevated to the status of a first principle. This aggressively secular globalist condition leaves the West culturally weakened and increasingly unmoored from the values, attitudes, artistic forms, institutions, experiences, ways of thinking, and yes, the religion that made Western peoples who they are, and reference to which is required of a healthy politics. At any rate, let me know what you think in the comments.